You see, for the longest time, an empath will love deeply. They'll try to understand. They'll analyze every silence, every withdrawal, every cold shoulder, not because they're weak, but because they care. They believe that love means staying long enough to heal the person who's afraid to be loved. They'll tolerate distance, confusion, mixed signals telling themselves maybe they just need time. But here's what changes everything the moment the empath wakes up. The moment they realize that understanding someone's pain doesn't mean accepting their pattern, that compassion is not an invitation for chaos, that love is supposed to feel safe, not exhausting. You see, avoidants often thrive on control, on keeping people close enough to feel wanted, but far enough to feel safe. It's a dance of push and pull. The empath gets caught up, trying to prove their worth, trying to show the avoidant that love doesn't have to hurt. But the most powerful thing that empath ever does is stop dancing. Because when the empath finally says, "no more," they reclaim their energy. They stop trying to decode every text, every silence, every inconsistency. They realize that the avoidant's comfort is not their responsibility. They understand that being kind doesn't mean being available to pain, and that's when the avoidant feels the real loss. Not because they've been abandoned, but because the empath they once took for granted has found peace in letting go. The empath no longer seeks closure, they are the closure. They stop chasing validation and start protecting their peace. An avoidant's greatest fear is not rejection, it's losing control. And nothing disrupts that control more than a person who no longer needs their approval to feel worthy. When an empath reaches that point, they become untouchable, calm, grounded, whole. So if you're the empath in that dynamic, know this: your softness is not weakness. Your capacity to care is not a flaw, but it only becomes your strength when you learn where to stop giving. You were never meant to save anyone at the cost of yourself. The most dangerous thing to someone who runs from love is the person who finally stops running after them. Empaths are naturally wired to feel deeply. They can sense emotions others can barely express, often absorbing feelings that aren't even theirs. This ability makes them compassionate, intuitive, and incredibly understanding, but it also makes them vulnerable. When they meet someone emotionally avoidant, someone who struggles to open up, the empath's instinct is to help, to heal, to hold space for their pain. They begin to interpret silence as hurt, withdrawal as fear, and inconsistency as a cry for love. Instead of seeing distance as disinterest, they see it as a wound they can nurture. And so they stay, they listen, they wait, they give. The empath believes that love, when given enough time, can transform anyone. They think that if they love hard enough, patiently enough, they can convince the avoidant to trust again, to see that not everyone leaves. But what they don't realize is that in this process, they slowly begin to lose themselves. They start walking on emotional eggshells, adjusting their tone, their expectations, even their truth, just to avoid triggering the other person's fear of closeness. Every time the avoidant pulls away, the empath reaches out harder, thinking their effort might make a difference. This dynamic drains the empath quietly. They begin to question their worth, wondering if they're asking for too much, if maybe they're the reason the other person shuts down. The empath confuses endurance for love and emotional labor for intimacy. They keep giving because giving is what they know. They stay because they can't bear the thought of someone suffering alone. But over time, they realize that their love has turned into a kind of emotional survival. They are no longer connecting, they're rescuing. And rescuing someone who doesn't want to be saved becomes a bottomless pit. The tragedy is that the empath's purest intention to love and understand becomes the very thing that traps them. They hold on to potential rather than reality. They fall in love with the person they believe the avoidant could become, not the one standing in front of them. And while they're busy holding space for another's healing, they forget to hold space for their own. The more they pour out, the emptier they become. Eventually, the empath must face a hard truth. Love cannot exist where there is no willingness. They can feel deeply, but they cannot feel asterisk for asterisk someone else. Their compassion, though beautiful, cannot replace someone's readiness to engage. Empaths are not weak for loving, but they suffer when they confuse sacrifice with strength. The moment they begin to understand that they cannot heal what resists healing, their power starts to return. Because empathy is not meant to be a burden, it is meant to be a bridge, and bridges are only strong when both sides are willing to meet in the middle. Awareness is the moment everything changes for an empath. It's that quiet yet powerful awakening when they finally begin to see patterns for what they truly are, not for what they wish them to be. For so long, the empath's world revolves around understanding others, excusing distance, rationalizing avoidance, and convincing themselves that patience is the key to love. They interpret withdrawal as pain, mixed signals as confusion, and inconsistency as vulnerability. But awareness cracks that illusion wide open. It's when they finally realize that love is not meant to be earned through endurance, and affection should not feel like a test. At first, this awareness can be painful. It feels like losing the dream that their love could fix, save, or soften someone who resists closeness. The empath begins to recognize that their worth has never depended on how much they can tolerate. They start to notice how much energy they've been giving away constantly checking in, explaining themselves, and holding space for someone who never meets them halfway. Awareness is not just about seeing the other person clearly. It's about seeing yourself honestly. It's understanding that no amount of love can replace someone's willingness to show up. As this awareness grows, the empath begins to detach from old stories the belief that they must always be the healer, the nurturer, the one who understands first. They stop romanticizing emotional unavailability and start valuing emotional safety. For the first time, they begin to ask, "What do I need?" instead of "What do they need?" They realize that love should add to their life, not drain it. The more they awaken, the less they chase. They no longer interpret silence as mystery or distance as depth. They see it simply as disconnection, and that clarity is liberating. Awareness also teaches the empath that boundaries are not walls, but mirrors. They reflect how much you value yourself. When the empath starts setting limits, it's not to punish or control anyone. It's to protect their peace. They stop trying to prove they're worthy of love through endless giving. They understand that their softness is sacred and must be guarded, not scattered. This shift from seeking approval to standing in self-respect is where true empowerment begins. The empath's awareness becomes a quiet strength. They no longer internalize rejection as proof of being unlovable, nor do they see detachment as a challenge to overcome. Instead, they accept that not everyone is capable of meeting them at the depth they desire, and that's okay. Awareness turns pain into wisdom. It reminds them that understanding someone's wounds doesn't mean accepting their harm. Once the empath embraces this truth, they begin to love differently with discernment, balance, and peace. They realize that real love flows naturally. It doesn't have to be chased, decoded, or earned. Avoidants often build emotional walls not out of cruelty, but out of fear of being seen too deeply, of losing control, of depending on someone else. Their instinct is to maintain safety by managing distance. They crave connection, but panic when it arrives. This creates a confusing dynamic where they pull you close just enough to feel wanted, then push you away the moment things feel too intimate. For an empath, this inconsistency becomes an emotional puzzle they feel compelled to solve. They think if they can just understand the reason behind the avoidance withdrawal, they can fix it. But what they don't realize is that this dance is not about love, it's about control. The avoidant feels powerful in uncertainty. When they give affection and then withdraw it, they create a rhythm where the empath becomes addicted to seeking closeness. Every small gesture of warmth feels feels like progress. Every bit of silence feels like failure. The empath's heart becomes tied to earning connection rather than simply sharing it. This imbalance keeps the avoidant in charge. They decide when to engage, when to retreat, when to open up just enough to keep hope alive. And for a time, the empath plays along, mistaking emotional scarcity for depth. But this pattern only lasts as long as the empath reacts. The moment the empath stops chasing, questioning, or rescuing, the dynamic begins to unravel. Without the empath's constant energy feeding it, the avoidant loses control of the emotional narrative. Silence no longer gets a reaction. Distance no longer provokes pursuit. The empath's stillness becomes unsettling to someone who relied on their effort to maintain the illusion of closeness. For the first time, the avoidant feels what it's like to lose their emotional anchor. When the empath steps back, they are no longer trapped in the cycle of push and pull. They begin to see the pattern clearly, how each withdrawal was a way to test their loyalty, how each brief reconnection was meant to reset control. They realize love should never feel like a reward you have to earn. It's not supposed to feel like chasing crumbs of affection from someone terrified of vulnerability. When the empath stops playing the game, the avoidance tactics lose their power. And that is the avoidant's greatest challenge. They cannot control someone who has learned self-worth. The empath's calm detachment becomes louder than any silence the avoidant can create. It reveals the truth. Connection cannot be built on control, and love cannot thrive in emotional inconsistency. The moment the empath no longer responds from fear of losing the relationship, they reclaim their strength. The dynamic that once kept them trapped becomes irrelevant. The avoidant is left to face their own distance, and the empath finally finds peace in stepping away from the chase. Letting go is one of the hardest yet most powerful acts an empath can experience. For someone who has built their identity around understanding, healing, and holding on, release feels unnatural at first. It feels like giving up on someone they once believed they could reach, someone they poured their energy, love, and compassion into. But as painful as it may be, letting go is not a sign of defeat, it's an act of awakening. It's the moment the empath realizes they can no longer save someone who refuses to meet them halfway. It's when they finally understand that love cannot grow where effort is one-sided and vulnerability is met with avoidance. When the empath decides to let go, they begin to take back their emotional power. They stop replaying conversations in their mind, searching for where things went wrong. They stop blaming themselves for someone else's inability to open up. Instead, they begin to see the truth, that love is a two-way exchange, and no amount of empathy can fill the silence of someone unwilling to speak. In this realization, the empath learns that closure doesn't come from explanations, it comes from acceptance. Acceptance that not every connection is meant to last, and not every heart is ready to receive the depth they offer. As the empath detaches, a strange calm begins to settle in. The anxiety that once came from unanswered messages and emotional distance starts to fade. They no longer wait for validation, for signs of change, for moments of reassurance. They stop needing proof that they mattered, because they already know they did. The difference now is that their peace matters more than their attachment. In walking away, the empath reclaims their time, their energy, and most importantly, their self-respect. Letting go also allows the empath to rediscover themselves. In the quiet after the storm, they start to reconnect with the parts of them that were neglected, the dreams, the boundaries, the joy they once postponed in the name of love. They realize that real connection should not drain them, it should replenish them. They begin to love from a place of strength, not sacrifice. They start to understand that they are not responsible for another person's healing journey, especially when that person resists growth. When the empath finally lets go, they become unshakable. They no longer crave closure or chase answers because they've found peace within themselves. The avoidant silence no longer holds power, and the cycle of hope and disappointment loses its grip. What remains is clarity, a deep, grounded awareness that love cannot coexist with chaos. The empath's freedom is not in getting the other person back, but in never losing themselves again. Letting go becomes the ultimate act of self-love, a gentle declaration that they are ready to stop surviving love and start living it fully. True empathy has never been about tolerating pain. It has always been about understanding without losing yourself in the process. For a long time, many empaths confuse compassion with self-abandonment. They believe that loving someone means absorbing their struggles, excusing their detachment, and carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone. They see boundaries as barriers and fear that saying no makes them less kind or less caring. But in truth, boundaries are where empathy becomes powerful, where love turns from dependency into balance. A heart that has no limits ends up running empty. To care deeply without direction is not compassion, it's chaos dressed as love. When an empath begins to set boundaries, something incredible happens. They stop trying to fix others and start choosing peace. They understand that their ability to feel deeply is a gift, not a duty. They realize that protecting their emotional space doesn't make them selfish, it makes them sustainable. Each boundary becomes a quiet declaration of self-worth. I can care about you, but I will not lose myself in your storm. And that shift, that moment of self-respect, is what makes them powerful. Because when the empath starts honoring their limits, they no longer allow manipulation, guilt, or inconsistency to define their relationships. Avoidants, who rely on emotional distance to maintain control, struggle deeply with this kind of strength. They are used to the empath bending, overgiving, and waiting. They expect forgiveness to come easily and understanding to be endless. But when the empath says, enough, everything changes. They no longer chase, explain, or absorb blame. They no longer confuse love with endurance. Their silence becomes more meaningful than any argument. Their distance becomes a reflection of clarity, not punishment. For the first time, the avoidant sees what it means to lose access, not because the empath is angry, but because they are awake. Boundaries don't harden the empath, they refine them. They allow the empath to love with intention rather than desperation. Instead of giving until they are drained, they give from a place of overflow where empathy is shared freely, but never at the cost of self-respect. It's in this space that their compassion becomes healing rather than heavy. They no longer take responsibility for emotions that aren't theirs. They stop mistaking other people's silence for an invitation to prove their worth. When an empath learns to stand firm, they become a mirror to anyone who once took advantage of their softness. Their strength exposes every dynamic built on imbalance. The avoidance push and pull no longer works because the empath has stepped into emotional independence. Their care is still deep, their heart still open, but it is now guided by wisdom. They understand that empathy without boundaries invites pain, but empathy with self-respect transforms it into power. In the end, this journey reminds us that love without boundaries is not love, it's self-abandonment. The fed-up empath becomes powerful not through anger, but through awareness, by choosing peace over pursuit and self-respect over approval. They no longer chase closure because they've found it within. And that is what makes them the avoidant's greatest threat: calm, grounded, and free. Thank you for listening, and may you always choose love that feels safe, mutual, and true.